Cell signaling and Parkinson's disease. G-protein coupled receptor cell signal pathway is a cell communication method associated with polar signal molecules that cannot diffuse through the cell membrane. A signaling molecule, or a ligand, attaches to the extracellular side of the G-protein coupled receptor, which is located in the cellular membrane. After the ligand is attached, the receptor changes shape. An inactive G-protein with a GDP then moves to the receptor and binds with it. A phosphate also attaches to the protein, turning the GDP into GTP, which makes the protein active. The G-protein then detaches from the receptor and moves along the cell membrane to the inactive enzyme, which is adenylyl cyclase. This enzyme, when activated, will produce cyclic AMP, or CAMP. It will then convert the ATP to CAMP, which will then activate the phosphorylation cascade. CAMP will activate protein kinase A, which is also known as pKa, which then activates protein kinase B through phosphorylation, or the addition of a phosphate to a protein. This continuous phosphorylation then results in a protein being released to the endoplasmic reticulum, which concludes the transduction. This protein will bind to the ligand-gated ion channel in the endoplasmic reticulum. After the protein binds, calcium ions are released, which is the cellular response. In the tyrosine kinase receptor system, multiple phosphates are attached to tyrosines, which can trigger multiple transduction pathways. In this case, two ligands bind to the ligand binding site of each tyrosine kinase protein. This causes the two tyrosines to join together and become a dimer through a process known as dimerization. As a result, 6 ATP molecules then attach a phosphate group to the tyrosines. The ATP, through dephosphorylation, becomes ADP. The relay proteins then bind to the phosphorylated tyrosines. The proteins then become activated after attaching to the phosphate. One of these active relay proteins will phosphorylate protein kinase A. The phosphorylation cascade becomes active again, and this ends the transduction pathway, with the protein being activated and traveling to the endoplasmic reticulum, where it will bind to the gated ion channel and release calcium ions as the cellular response. In a person not affected with Parkinson's disease, they will have a sufficient amount of dopamine, or neurotransmitter, released through the synaptic gap from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. This signal pathway is very similar to the G-protein receptor pathway. The dopamine is packaged into vesicles in the presynaptic neuron and released into the synaptic gap, where it will travel and bind as the ligand to the D1 and D2 receptors of the postsynaptic neuron. D1 receptors activate adenylyl cyclase, which will cause the formation of CAMP, whereas D2 receptors block the signaling pathway. Once it is binded to the D1 receptor, the G-protein gains a phosphate, which changes GDP to GTP, and it will become active. It will travel towards this adenylyl cyclase and activate it, which will cause CAMP to form. CAMP starts the phosphorylation cascade again by activating pKa, or protein kinase A, and it will end with a cellular response. The cellular response is usually a voluntary muscular movement or an emotional response. One affected with Parkinson's has a deficiency of dopamine. Due to genetic mutations on the LRRK2 gene on the 12th chromosome, PARK7 and PINK1 genes on the 1st chromosome, and the alpha-synuclein gene on the 4th chromosome. As a result of these mutations, the dopamine in the presynaptic neuron does not get released into the synaptic gap to bind with the D1 and D2 receptors. Through the process of proteasomal degradation, dopamine is digested and broken down by the cell. In proteasomal degradation, the cell breaks down any substances it believes is unnecessary. No dopamine is released and postsynaptic signaling is blocked, which means no voluntary movement or emotional response will come about. Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative disease, which means that it gets worse over time. There are no known causes, but there are some factors that can increase the risk of it, which include age, concussions, and gender. There are no known cures either, but medication can be taken to increase the dopamine levels. Surgery can also be performed to inactivate areas of the brain, which can help improve motor functions, and medical marijuana has been found to temporarily relieve symptoms. Some symptoms include slow to no voluntary movement, no emotional response, balance problems, shakiness, stiffness, and frequent tremors.